Hello, it's author Tonya Duncan Ellis with another episode of Write This, My Author Interview Show. I'm happy to have you join me for another great author interview. And this week we have author Nadia Salomon, who will be on to talk about writing picture books. And I am excited to look at her beautiful book or to share it with you. It is gorgeous. It's a bedtime story called Goodnight Ganesha. And I became aware of it a few months ago and fell in love. So it'll be wonderful to hear about her author journey, her books, and all the projects she has coming up. I see that she's already joined us, so I'm going to have her come in. I want to thank you all for tuning in. If you have any questions as we go along with the interview, please put them in the chat and we'll respond to as many as we can. So let me get her on here now. Got her coming on. Okay, so she'll be on and we're going to have a wonderful time today. Hey, Nadia, how you doing?
Good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm so excited. I saw the beautiful advertisement you made for our interview. I loved that.
Oh,
And it
you're
got
welcome.
yeah, I need to get you on board to help me with some of my graphic skills because that was so nice.
I use Canva.
Okay, I use that.
Yeah.
I love how you had our books coming in and our pictures coming in. It was so cute. So I got to do that for next time for myself.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to, treat you to a Canva tutorial if you'd like.
Yes. And I first became aware of you, Nadia, when you spoke at one of the SCBWI conferences. And I really loved the talk you gave on, I think it was on Twitter pitches. So I may ask you questions about that.
Yeah.
And, you also made me want to see the movie The Matrix.
Oh my God, that's my all-time favorite.
See, I've never watched it, but you made it so cool. Like listening to that, I was telling my husband, have you watched that? Because I want to watch it now.
Yes. I don't know how many times I've seen it, but it's like, it doesn't matter when that comes on. If it's on, I'm like, okay, I drop everything and I watch because it was one of the most incredible movies ever made, and still to date, like none of the, sequels after it, like can even compete. It was so groundbreaking and just amazing. And so I don't know, that and Avatar, those are my two movies that I can't get enough of.
I am going to watch that. And you made me want to watch it because you used that as a theme in your presentation.
Yes.
It made it so interesting.
Yes.
But can you share a little bit about you and your background? How did you get into writing, and tell us your whole backstory?
All right. Well, my backstory is I've been a writer my entire life, I'd say. Ever since I was a kid, I've always wanted to write, and I knew at some point in my life that I would be an author, but I just didn't know when that would be. But it happened after I became a mom, and I was reading picture books and realized how much I love them. And so I started writing picture books. And then I also wanted to write novels, but that's a topic for a different day. But writing has been in my blood. I went to school for journalism. I was a journalist for quite some time, and that helped me with my writing skills as well. So writing has always been a part of every journey that I've had. So
that's really cool. And it's interesting to me, so many of the people I've had on do have a journalism background.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really neat to see.
Yeah, it's a creative outlet, being a journalist actually helps you. I think like the skills that I gained with being a journalist is to be able to tell a story that's universal and then have it resonate with people emotionally, because when you go for your interviews, the whole point of having an interview is to gain insight into the story, into the characters or the people that you're talking about and their emotion, because everything is always a reaction to the story that you're telling. And so I feel that all the skills that I learned as a journalist also play a part in helping me to write emotional truths when I write.
Right, that's cool. Now, what kind of stories do you write? I know your newest book, Goodnight Ganesha, is that pronounced properly?
Goodnight Ganesha.
Goodnight Ganesha. So it's a bedtime story. So can you tell us a little bit about that, and then other projects that you're working on?
Yeah, sure. Goodnight Ganesha, it came about as I was putting my child to bed, and we were reading Goodnight Ganesha as we had read Goodnight Moon so many times. And my child looked up at me and asked, "Well, Mom, hey, do you think you could ever, write a story about our bedtime routine?" And I was like, "Yeah, I don't know, maybe someday." And then I was like, maybe somebody else can write like a bedtime story about, our experience. And my kid was like, "Well, you're a writer, right? Like, why are you telling me this?" And I was like, "Well, I'm just trying to pass the buck." Maybe somebody else could write that story. I don't know. I'm like, who would want to read a bedtime story about us? Like, who? And it was at that moment I was like, I have no choice but to write a bedtime story. And so I started with what I knew, which was Goodnight Moon, and how we had been reading it for literally 7 years straight,
I love
almost
Goodnight
nightly.
Moon. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And I always thought it was an interesting story. And so I I I took that idea and the request that was made, and I sat down and I started writing a bedtime story. And I decided to just kind of give people a look at what we do when we go to bed at night when we're visiting Nana overseas. And I just felt like I wanted to be authentic to our bedtime routine, because like when we're here in America, our bedtime routine, like it's not a real routine, because it's kind of like it's chaotic, as I'm sure it is with every parent trying to get their kid to sleep. But I just felt like the stuff that we did when we were visiting, because there aren't so many influences, or as a parent you're always struggling with time.
Mm.
Whereas I felt like when we're over there, bedtime just always feels so much calmer. And so I thought I'd write about that experience. So
Now,
I wrote about that
where are you referring to? You didn't say.
when we're going to Hyderabad, India.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so when we're overseas in India visiting with Nana, it's just it's a bit calmer than like when you're at home here, US. It's like everything's chaotic before bed, right?
Right.
Work, work, work. We have to pack our lunch, and all that stuff. Whereas over there, it's kind of like we don't have to go to school the next day. It's just kind of like roll out of bed, and you do whatever. And so that's how I ended up writing Goodnight Ganesha. And I was really inspired by Goodnight Moon. But when I wrote it originally, it was only like 136 words. And then when I sent it through my critique group and eventually my agent that I acquired during that time, they felt that it should be something longer, a longer work, and it should be more lyrical, and it should be more of my own story. And
Mm.
so that's what I ended up doing, making it more of my own story, including Telugu culture, into the story, and talking about what it would be like to have a bedtime routine, or have people follow our bedtime routine when we're overseas. And that's how Goodnight Ganesha came to be. And as far as my body of work and what I write all sorts of stories. I mine my youth experiences, or experiences that I have with my own child. So, it could be anything from, again, bedtime, um, sibling rivalry. That's like another theme that I write on, because I grew up in a big family. So it's kind of like I've got stories. Um, Growing up, in an immigrant family, even though I was born American, I have lots of stories about language, right? That I can write about. So I write about those themes, Caribbean culture. I have a couple of STEM books, and then I have a graphic novel that I'm working on right now, which is um, a magical realism story, and it's like a fantasy, kind of like how to train your dragon meets the golden compass. So right now I'm like working on world building. It's like taking me forever, and if anyone who knows me knows, I've been working on this since NaNoWriMo. I got my synopsis accepted. However, I'm still working on the manuscript, or the script for the graphic novel, because I'm just trying to get my head in the game in terms of world building, which is where I'm stuck. And then, like, I keep forgetting some of the characters. Like, I'll talk about them, but forget to put them in the scene. So now I'm like, oh, I have to go back and do that. And then I just wrapped up a class that I took, which was really, really cool. It's how to write with tarot cards, because I love tarot cards. And so I swear to you, like, all the cards that I pulled off the tarot cards literally matched like what I was writing about. And so now I'm learning how to read, what the significance of each of those cards means in relation to the story, the arc, my characters, like their emotions and everything. So it was just, I was blown away after taking the class for that. But those are the things that I'm working on. And I kind of have a play in the works too. You heard it here first. And that's only because I had conversations with a couple of critique partners, and after talking to Ann Winter, because I just did a podcast with her, she was talking about playwriting and stuff, and so I was just like, ooh, that's a great idea. So I have a lot that's happening and in the works, but trying to take them one at a time.
Now, so when you mention your culture, so you have Indian and Caribbean roots, is that right?
Not for me. I am Haitian Lebanese. And
Oh,
my husband is South Indian. So my
oh, okay.
family is from Hyderabad, India, and my family is from Haiti. So my dad is mixed, my mom is mixed, but we're Haitian Lebanese because my grandfather was a Lebanese Jew who, for whatever was happening in Lebanon at the time, he left for political reasons. We don't know. We're still, trying to research and figure it out. But he ended up going to the Caribbean, and he met a Haitian woman, got married, had my dad, and my mom is native slash French Haitian. So it's like I have roots like pretty much in every identity you could possibly think of. But because of that, it's just so much easier to just say I'm Haitian Lebanese, whereas like going into every single, part of what makes me who I am, it's like, it's so hard. But, that's what I identify with. I grew up at home where English wasn't my first language. I mean, even being born here, Creole and French were my first languages. And so when I went to school, I had to learn English like all the other, immersion students, because people were like, hey, I thought you were born here. And it was like, yeah, but, my parents, when they were here trying to build a life for us, they sent me back to family in Haiti who raised me for the first 2 years of my life. And I came back, and my parents never spoke a lick of English to me at home because they didn't feel the need to. Even now, as elderly adults, they still don't speak to us in English.
But I know, like I majored in French in school, and I do speak French. It's tiring because I've lived over there. To speak in a foreign language
Mm-hmm.
over time is probably just more comfortable for them at home
Oh, yeah.
to
Yeah.
speak in their native tongue or whatever they learned growing up.
Yeah. And it's also like, I feel like once you grow up, and like, if English wasn't the first language that you learned, even your thinking isn't in English. Like
Right.
when I get mad or frustrated or upset, like English is a backseat language for me, because the first words out of my mouth are something in Creole or in French. It's not English. So I feel like every time I speak, I'm always compartmentalizing like my language. So it's just kind of I don't know what the experience is for someone else who speaks a different language, but for me, I'm always struggling with that. It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's three languages all up here, plus whatever else other language I've learned when I need to speak it. So yeah.
And something you said that's really interesting to me too, Nadia, that I really love is how you're talking about how you're using your own life experiences. Because a lot of times as writers, when they're trying to struggle to figure out what to write, it was kind of out of the mouths of babes for you. Your child told you, Mom, what
Right.
about what we do? So just looking myself, I look at how I do things.
Right.
Or
Yeah, ideas come from everywhere. For me, it, there's one manuscript that I haven't sent to my agent yet, but I'm still working on revisions. But it's a bedtime story about like my kid who, uh, she woke up one day and she was just so upset, and we're like, well, like, why are you upset? And she was like, well, you have daddy, right? And she's like, why is it I'm being forced to sleep in my own bed? And like, I can't share a bed with Nana. And I'm like, well, that's because you're at an age where you're growing up and you're going to need your privacy. And it's important for you to be independent and have your own space. Don't you want your own space? No. And I was
Oh,
like,
that's a
okay,
great story for, yeah, I've never
right.
seen that in a picture book.
Yeah. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to write about that. And so
Right.
I'm like, I use my kid as fodder for stuff. Why
Right.
not?
And there you're writing a children's book, so
Right.
that's because I'm inspired a lot by things my kids do in my books
Yeah.
or have done, yeah, or
Yeah.
other children I see around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or stories like there's another one that I just wrote recently is because um she just had to say goodbye to one of her besties. And it was it's funny, not funny like haha funny, but just you never really think about how it impacts your child really, because for us as adults it's like you gain a friend, lose a friend. It's like it's part of the process of friendship. Sometimes some last and some don't, and so we're going through the phase right now where we're learning about that.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's not the first time that she's lost a friend. So we've lost friends to Germany, we've lost friends to Switzerland, we've lost friends to kids who go back to India, we've lost friends to kids who go out of state or like the next town over.
Mm-hmm.
So this friend is just moving the next town over, but in my child's mind, it's like going to Germany. It's like
Right.
going to Switzerland or India or wherever else the child's family decides to go if they go overseas. And so that is an experience that I was like, that's an interesting story. I know there are plenty of stories about friendship and like Evelyn Del Rey is moving away, or
Oh,
Forever
yeah.
Friends. Like those are some of the newer books that have come out, but none are like the experience that we're going through. So I decided, well, let me write a little bit about that. And so that's how I'm ending up writing some of my
Mhm.
stories. I I have a kid and I'm
Right.
thankful for those stories, but I also have, stories of my own where I have never seen myself, my family, my people really, in a book. And I would like for some of the manuscripts that I'm working on that cover those identities to also be in a book
Right. And
someday.
I love that too. Just I've become more and more aware as recent statistics have come out showing numbers for different ethnic groups, people of color. I
Right.
want to encourage all people of color to write and even to get into the traditional process because a lot
Yeah.
of people just don't know about that. But we need to see the numbers rise with African Americans, Black
Mm-hmm.
authors in particular,
Mm-hmm.
getting in those traditional spaces. And I think
Yeah.
some don't even try because they don't know what to do.
Well, the problem is I'm gonna tell people this straight. Okay. So as someone who is BIPOC, you know, I'm I'm Haitian Lebanese, I'm of African Arab descent, and you're taught at home growing up that your voice doesn't matter because the voices are always about black versus white. And that's all that we see all the time being pushed. But then those of us who have different cultures are always kind of like overlooked because we're seen as like the shades of gray.
Mhm.
And so, because the voices are always so strong in other communities, you're able to get your stories out. But when you're conditioned, because you emigrated to this country, so like, even though you adopt American culture, and you are American, but like your root identity is still not seen, right?
Mhm.
And it's like you're made to feel that like, oh, you're occupying the space, but like nobody wants to hear about like what happens like in a Haitian home. Nobody wants to hear what happens like in a Lebanese home. They're like, just talk about like American things because you were raised American and because you're constantly straddling worlds. So where I go home and I can talk about, hey, let's eat some jus la poire and fruit banan, right? Which is I'm gonna eat some fried rice and fried plantains. They're like, what American cares or wants to hear that story? So that's the mentality that our parents, like my generation parents, have in their minds.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
feel like that impacts my generation, where I was born American, versus my siblings, who most of them were born overseas and emigrated to the US and became naturalized citizens. So it's always like, oh, you're American, we're not. Like, that's always been the big elephant in the room. And I feel like that also translates into, my generation, when we want to tell our stories, because we know there are stories to tell. But when you present your story, let's say to an agent or an editor, um, this is kind of changing, which is great. But before then, it was like, oh, how can you make this more commercial? How can you make this more American? And so
Right.
that's the fight that we've always had to have as people of color from different, you know, um, immigrant backgrounds. I see it in the Daishi Kidlit community, where that's always a concern. It's like, well, how do I tell my story and be authentic to it?
Right.
And it's kind of like, you just tell your story. And if someone asks you to change it, and changing it is not right, you just say no. I'd rather not sell a book, right? Or tell a story if someone's not going to accept it for the truth that I am speaking. Because you can't tell me that my experience is wrong, or my experience, oh, you've never heard of such a thing, which I've heard, before, in one of my manuscripts, where I wrote it. I haven't, I need to revise it for my agent, but it was like, when I went to school, I kept speaking Creole to everybody, right? French to everybody, but no one spoke it. So they were telling me that what I was speaking was gibberish. And so I got in trouble at school for speaking Creole. I got in trouble at school for speaking French, because they're like, we don't know what language you're speaking. We don't know what you're saying. It doesn't make any sense. Like, nobody understood me. And I was infuriated, because I thought to myself, well, how come when I go home, everybody understands? Because, like I said, my parents only at home, it's Creole, French only, like no English. English is only outside of the home or when I went to school. And so someone actually said to me, like, oh, that's unrealistic. You can't write a story like that. And I'm like, well, I went through that experience. Sorry, it is realistic. It may not be for the rest of the world, but for me, it was an experience that I had.
Right.
And so I wrote that story. Will I sell it? We'll see. But the point is, we all have stories to tell, regardless of our nationalities, regardless of where our families emigrated from. And I want to say to everyone who is out there watching, and you are, I don't care, Trinidadian, you're like, from Jamaica, or like, any other country, Syria, Lebanon, like, tell your story. People need to hear your stories, because all our experiences are different. All our experiences are unique. And I think it's important for us to share it, because writing Goodnight Ganesha was an eye-opening experience for me. Because when I wrote this book changed my child's life. And I'm not saying it because I wrote the book. I'm saying it because I sat here in this office and I cried like I have never cried in my life, because my child felt seen. They saw their identity in this book. I can't say that. That's going to be a tough sell for me. I can relate to certain stories, like Auntie Luce's paintings, that was written by Francis Letour, which is about, a child who has Haitian parents, and they're straddling the lines of being Haitian and American. I can relate to that story. When I read that story for the first time, I felt like, oh, part of my identity was seen, right? 10 Ways to Hear Snow. That was the first time I had really seen a book that was written by someone who is of Arab descent, that was talking about Arab culture. I felt seen, right? Where are you from? By Jamili Syed Mendez, right? That's always the question that I've been asked my entire life, until even now. Where are you from? Do you speak English? I mean, just the sheer ignorance of people. Like, those are the books that I feel that I've read, that I can say resonated with me in a way that, like, I can't read any of them without crying, because that is feeling seen. So when I say to you, representation matters, it matters. Even though I didn't know it mattered, but it matters. And the Daishi Kidlit community, I love them to death because I matter.
Oh, sweet.
Because their stories resonated with me because of my family.
Well, you know, Nadia, as you were speaking, something occurred to me as well. Even when we had Haitian refugees trying to come over here and
Right,
people didn't want them, knowing these stories and humanizing these characters, you know, presenting them to children can
right,
change hearts and get a lot of people, you know, understanding other people. So
right,
keeping these stories hidden is part of the reason we have the problems as a nation. Is it,
right,
you know, to me, that's why we have these problems.
right. And then the funny thing is, this may not go over well with people, but this is something that I feel, and, it bothers me because I find that, I may share an identity with a group. Just because I share that identity with the group doesn't necessarily mean that, like, their experience is my experience, because I straddle worlds. So for me, I'm always fighting being enough. Am I Haitian enough? Am I Lebanese enough? Am I Tayano enough? Like, you're never enough. And even within your own family, people will tell you, oh, you're not 100%. And it's kind of like, last I checked, yeah, I am. So it's kind of like, you know, there, there's no single story. Just because I share an identity doesn't mean that, like, I can relate to that experience because I've not had that experience. But what I want is for everyone to be able to tell their story so that we can all collectively grieve, mourn, share hope, share love, so that we say, I see you. So every single person who's watching, I want you to be able to say, I see you. I had this conversation yesterday with this woman that I was talking to because I was booking a hotel room for, just to get away and kind of, find some time for myself. But the sad thing is, we were talking about the state of the world today, right now, as we speak. War in Ukraine shouldn't be happening. I don't understand why, the people in power just cannot make this war stop. All these people that are dying, that are hurting, I don't understand it. All the stuff that's happening with COVID, all this, like, transphobia, like, I don't get it. I thought we were going to a better place, but yet we're taking more than, like, centuries back, because people are homophobic, people are transphobic, people are racist. And, even if I wanted to tell my story right now, I feel like, okay, I'll still write that story and put it out there. But, like, once it comes out, how do we even keep it on a bookshelf? Right? Most of the stories right now that are being banned are all BIPOC, people who write about gender, right? People who are not white, right? And don't tell me that, like, oh, parents are so up in arms about, their kid learning about this. Blah, that's a lot of baloney. So I don't know what it's going to take for people to wake up and accept other people's stories without telling them to change the narrative.
Yeah. But really, the genie is out of the bottle. And even though people are trying to muffle voices and, you know, silence stories, it's just, there's no way that they can do this anymore. The stories are being told. We have social media platforms. So these stories are being told more than ever.
Right.
You know?
Even though they're being banned, there are ways around it, but I just don't understand the ban, because it's nonsensical.
Right.
And like, like, a majority of the stories that they're banning are stories that people need.
Right. It's really
Kids
sad.
need.
it was really infuriating to me. But what I'm seeing is that many of those books are becoming New York Times bestsellers,
Yeah.
you know,
But
because of this. So,
yeah, I just feel like there's too much power given to certain voices. There's just too much power. And I just feel like lawmakers themselves, like there, there's something in it for them, a lot of them that are creating these laws and making things so difficult. I don't know. That's probably a conversation for a different day, but I just find it, just so maddening because everywhere I look, everywhere I turn, it's like they're banning books. Oh, a teacher just got fired because like he read a book about butts. I
I
mean,
saw.
that's a book that's been out for like who knows, and he's had it in his classroom since forever. And so he read it, and just because one person deemed it, not okay, then it's like he gets fired for it. I mean, that's just nonsensical. Or even Jarrett Lerner, his books, like those books are also getting banned. You have simple books like what is it, Grace Lynn's book, a big mooncake, her mooncake book. What's wrong with that book? Like, why is that being banned? Like, people should be asking, like, okay, seriously, like, why are some of our books being banned? Why? Because,
Right.
but then it's okay for Catcher in the Rye, even though I love that book, but like for that to still be an okay book, maybe it's been in the banned list, like, and I don't know what I'm talking about, but like, right? But just
Right.
some of these kinds of thinking, it impacts people. And I want, writers, authors, kids, anyone who's listening right now, write your story. It doesn't matter. Don't worry about it being banned. Just write it. Just write it.
Right.
That's all
Right.
that we can do. Keep
Yeah.
writing them and hoping, you know, we have great editors and agents who see the potential, who see the value in that story for it to be published. Take
Right.
those chances because we need those chances because, I hate to say it, but there are gatekeepers still, like in the publishing industry.
Yes, there are.
We know that.
Well, you have unpacked quite a bit today. Now you've
Well, let
got
me
a
tell
lot
you,
of.
today's just one of those days where, like, I rolled out of bed and I just watched the news and I'm like, ugh, I'm embarrassed to be, you know, here watching this in this supposed new world with all this inclusivity, but it still doesn't feel inclusive.
But I feel like really what's happening is there's a change and there's just this pushback, this last gasp to hold on to this privilege and all
Mm-hmm.
this. And really the walls are coming down. And this is kind of like a last stand trying, but I don't feel it's going to achieve its purpose because people want truth, they want information, and I don't feel like it's going to work. And even with
Of course not.
your book is a universal story. Even though you're taking that culture, you're going to India and you're showing that all parents, I was thinking when I go to my mom's house with my kids, it was a different kind of bedtime. So
Right.
even though you're using this, showing the details of the time in India, these stories are universal for all of us.
Yeah, they are. And we need universal stories because that's what shows people that we're the same.
Right. That's why we need these stories because hiding and hiding the truth and all that, we're all human, we're all God's children, we're all humanity. And so showing these things and not hiding them
Right.
shows that we're one, we're all people.
Yeah. I I feel like um, in the current landscape, we have a better chance of being able to tell our stories than we ever have been, considering, you know, um, it's not until recently, really. I'd say maybe in the last 3 or 4 years that we've been seeing more and more inclusive stories, but there's still not enough,
Right.
right?
And
There's
I
still not
think
enough.
people need to know, just all the BIPOC authors need to know that they need to write their stories and present their stories,
Right.
not just stay in the silo of self-publishing. And I've been a self-publisher for years, but that's why I'm moving beyond that, because
Mm-hmm.
our voices need to be heard,
Right.
and I don't want someone else telling my story.
Right.
And
And I
yeah.
think that's I also think we need to be very careful with the telling of my story and understanding that like the difference. And by that I mean there are stories that even though it is your story, but it shouldn't prevent someone of a different nationality, of a different ethnic group, even someone who is Caucasian, to write or tell that story. And by that, I mean, I liken it to journalism. So let's say news is happening and they send a reporter out to tell the story. Your job as a journalist is to go cover that story and tell the story, regardless of who the main characters are, because that's your job. You tell the story as it happened, versus telling the story from that voice, from that identity, and from that
Oh,
perspective. So,
yes. Yeah.
for example, if I wanted to write about the taking of Alcatraz by the Native American people, I can write about that from a journalistic perspective because I can talk about facts. But I cannot write a story as though I experienced what happened during that time, or fabricate a story about something that happened during that time and present it as though it were my story. I can't do that. But if you're going to talk facts, I think it's okay for anyone to be able to tell a story. And I think we need to clarify that, make that distinction, because sometimes it's okay for someone else to help tell a story, especially if it's a story that needs to be told and it's not being told. So you
Oh,
could still tell it, but as fact. But I can't tell the story as though it happened to me because it was not my experience. It was
right.
not my identity to talk about.
Okay, that's a great way to put that, because for me, looking at the statistics, I went through them last week, and it was just troubling to me that less than half the children's books traditionally published that featured Black characters were written by Black authors. So
Right.
I just felt like we needed more Black authors to tell these stories, because they only represent 9% of the total stories told. So there's room for all to tell any story.
Right.
And that I just feel like other BIPOC groups have that full, most of the ones with Asian characters are written by Asian authors.
Mm-hmm.
The Latinx, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they are written by
Latinx. Yeah.
people from that background. But the
Right.
ones with the Black characters are not.
Not well. That's something that goes back to before we came to the realization that um, it's not someone else's job to tell your story,
Right. But I think a
but they
lot
took
of
it
those
upon
authors
themselves.
don't know what to do. They need to be educated and get themselves involved in the process.
Right. But it's
Yeah.
also, I think it's also the way that people think, because just because someone happens to be from a different culture, a different, or I identifies as a different, different from what you are, I still don't think you should be telling people you can't write my story,
Right.
especially if they're not writing the story from your perspective.
Right.
Where I
And
have
yeah,
a
I'm
problem
not
about
saying
it,
that. Yeah.
where I have a problem about it is someone who um, is, from a different culture, writing as though they are me. There's a difference.
Right. And there are many like that that are written in that voice, and you don't really realize that it's a different person.
Right.
And you're saying, hey, wait a minute. Yeah.
Well, that can be said for example, there's this author who writes kids books, and she writes it from lived experience, where like I'm not that offended that she wrote about like the Haitian experience, because she's written books about Haitian characters, kids from like different Caribbean nations, but these are all places that she's lived in, or she's interacted um, with the culture, and she wrote a story um, in that way. Like, I feel like if you're going to write, because I do this, I write from lived experience. Goodnight Ganesha is from lived experience, from what I do with my kid, right?
Mhm.
So if you're going to write that story, make sure you're accurate. Whatever language you're using, whatever nuance you're using, whatever mannerisms that you're going to put in your story, it has to be authentic. It has to be real as I experience it. Because when I read her books initially, I didn't realize that she happened to be someone Caucasian. I thought, oh, it was like, someone Haitian who wrote the story. But they weren't. Am I offended by that? No, because I thought she wrote the stories well, and it actually gave me an opportunity to actually see my culture, my identity in a book.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like my own people weren't really writing these stories, except for like now we have more and more, Haitian American, authors coming to the scene. But, I'd still love to see more, of, Haitian Americans writing about the Haitian experience. Because let me tell you, we have funny stories to tell. Because, just like, with your own identity, with your own culture, what stories you want to tell. And you don't want to tell the story from like, that colonial perspective, which unfortunately is going to be there because we are in America and we're always the minority. So the majority always has an influence on you. Like this was a conversation that came up about that. And I'm like, it doesn't matter what you do. I'm like, just being born American, like it waters down your identity in a way. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. Like I'm saying it in a funny way because I grew up like straddling worlds. So it's kind of like, if my mom says, hey, what do you want to eat for dinner? And she's like, oh, I'm going to make legume and rice, right? Legume is kind of like, this paste that's made with like vegetables that you eat with white rice, and it could have chicken, shrimp, beef, whatever you want to put in it. And then I'll be like, hey mom, I want peanut butter and fluff. Or instead I'll be like, I want legume, but I only want it with Wonder Bread or something like that, right? So I'm blending both of those identities. Or like a good one is when my mother-in-law makes fresh rotes, and I go, yeah, I sure would love it. And then she's like, oh, do you want toku on there? Which is kind of like a, toku is kind of, sometimes they're like condiments that you put on your food. Like I like the tomato ones or the tamarind one. And then I'll be like, nah, I have a hankering for like peanut butter and jelly. So like my kid and I will be like, hey, Nana, can we get like PB and fluff or PB and J like in our rote? Right. So it's kind of like everything that we do, it's going to have a hand of something else in it because that's the identity and this is what we're growing up with. And it's kind of like everyone has their own difference, or it's kind of like Telegunderish or, I speak Kranglish or, what are you speaking? Everything we're speaking, it's like every other word is like English, but there's like Creole or there's Telugu or there's French or, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, I don't know. I just feel like our identities are changing and it changes with each generation, where my mom and dad can stay true to being like, who they are. But I mean, there's in them some way that makes them American. And the same thing for like my siblings who were born overseas, but grew up here, or me who was born here. There's always, I don't know, I feel like when you have immigrant roots, you always have that like dynamic that you have to fight. So there's no such thing as like, 100% this or 100% that. It's just, you know what? I just want to be. And I'm just going to write my truth. That's all I can do. Write my truth.
Well, we've unpacked a lot today, Nadia. You've given us plenty of food for thought and different touched on a lot of important issues. Right. So I thank you for sharing your truth and for dropping this knowledge on us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me this platform to express it, because I just feel that a lot of times we never talk about it honestly, openly, and people are always afraid. And I think it's important for writers, for agents, for editors to understand the new breed of, writers that are coming onto the scene. I'm not afraid to speak my truth. I'm not afraid to tell my story. And I'm not afraid to say, I'm sorry. I can't change that, because if I change it, then it doesn't resonate with me because it's not my story. So if you really want the truth, then you have to be open, agreeable to that. And only then can we really tell true stories without having to make stuff up for drama, for sales. Like, that doesn't work. And you'll find that the reason why people like Jackie Woodson, Jason Reynolds, their stories are so beloved is because they don't sugarcoat.
Right.
They speak their truth.
Right. That's
right. Kwame Alexander, they speak their truth. And I think it's really important for all of us, no matter what our ethnicity is, where we come from, what our backgrounds are, speak your truth. Speak the stuff that, like, no one would ever know if they didn't live in your house with you, because that's the true life that you're living, not what people want to read but sugarcoat it just for,
And they may not know what they want to read. When they hear the truth, that may be the thing that they needed and that they wanted all along.
Right. And I also think by reading other people's narratives, that's how you really get to understand people. That's how you really get to understand maybe why someone acts or thinks the way that they do, because in their experience, maybe they didn't know any differently. Right?
Right.
So,
well, I want to thank you for coming on today. Thank you for all of the information you've shared and the heartfelt talk that you've given us, because it's so useful for us all, and in these trying times that we're all experiencing.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for tuning in. And Nadia, where can they find you after the show? Where can people find you?
After the show, everybody knows I'm always on Twitter, always on IG. Those are really my two favorite places that I like to hang out. And if you want to know more about, like, all the stuff that I'm doing, just check out my website, because right now I've been lucky. Nick Patton of the Picture Booking podcast had invited me to do some interviews for him. So I have about 4 more to go. But so far I have 2, one with Rafael Lopez and one with the lovely Ann Winter. And so, check out the podcasts and let me know what you guys think, because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. So thank you.
Well, thank you all. And I hope you join me again next week for another episode of Write This. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was